And I believe all members are present, so we're going to move to the first question on topical question, which is from Sandra White. And Sandra White joins us remotely. Ms White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it is having with the university sector regarding students isolating because of COVID-19.
Minister Richard Lockhead.
This is a challenging time for many of Scotland's students, and we are in frequent direct conversation with the university sector around support for students who are self-isolating because of COVID-19 to underscore the importance of supporting students practically and emotionally. We have been assured that practical and welfare support is in place, but we are actively pressing universities to absolutely ensure that is the case. Institutions and providers are making arrangements for self-isolating students to be able to access food and essential supplies. Students can also access local authority services who provide support for self-isolating individuals who are otherwise unable to access food or other essentials. And this can be arranged through the National Assistance Helpline of 0800 1111 4000. The National Assistance Helpline is a service for those who cannot leave their home and cannot get the help they need in any other way. However, universities will have accessible wellbeing services with details on their websites as well. And the Student Information Scotland website has the student support pages of every institution, so they can signpost students to support that is available to them.
Sandra White.
Minister, for that reply, and I have indeed spoken to the universities in my area, my constituency. What I did want to ask, and I haven't had an answer from the universities, is have you had, the Scottish Government had any discussions, or have they taken place regarding students who have or wish to return home, but they want to resume their tenancies within the university halls once it's deemed safe to do so? And will there be financial penalties for these students?
Minister.
Thank you to the member for those questions, and they are very pertinent and relevant questions at the moment for many students in Scotland. Our advice to all students in Scotland is please to remain living in your current student household, in your current university accommodation, because that's the best way to prevent the spread of the virus in Scotland, just as we're giving advice across the whole of the nation to all sectors of society. However, we do recognise it's a very difficult time for many students, particularly those who may be self-isolating, particularly those first years who are perhaps away from home for the first time. And that's why we did issue guidance at the weekend after speaking to student bodies and the universities to outline under the current restrictions in Scotland under what conditions students can return home, and the ability is there for students to return home if they're unable to continue the way things are at university at the moment. But if they are able, we're asking them to remain within their student households in their current student accommodation. And in terms of the leases for their accommodation at university, we know that St Andrews and Glasgow University, for instance, have introduced a lot more flexibility in ensuring they're not penalising students who want to resign their leases even within their 28 days notice. And we have asked, and I've written to all Scotland's principals, asking for all universities to be very, very sympathetic to all students at this time.
And Sandra White.
Much, Presiding Officer. We know that we have a number of students who don't reside in halls, they reside in the private accommodation sector, and also obviously in HMOs in that respect. Now, I just wonder if you've had any discussions with the private student providers regarding guidance for their duty of care to their residents, and also in regards to if they wish to leave home. Have you had any correspondence or to tell them the Scottish Government's guidelines? Because in my constituency, I have a huge amount of private student accommodation in the Kelvin constituency.
Minister.
Yeah, that's a good point. And for purpose-built private student accommodation, the COVID regulations that we passed allow students to give 28 days notice for resigning their lease applies to those situations as well. And we've had regular conversations with the operators of those buildings, and they are also obliged to have a duty of care towards the residents and to ensure they're able to access necessary supplies if they're self-isolating.
Thank you. There's a lot of interest in this subject. We'll see how many members can get through. Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you. Ahead of the publication early on Friday evening, can the Minister tell me what consultation about the restrictions on students and their potential impact the Minister held with NUS Scotland?
Minister.
We've had regular conversations with NUS Scotland throughout the pandemic, and indeed I spoke to them again today as well. In terms of the guidance for students returning home, we were in conversations with the NUS Scotland to help input to that guidance as well. If he's referring to the guidance in terms of socialising over the weekend, we offered our support to University Scotland because that was advice they were giving to Scotland students just for the previous weekend alone, to not socialise outside of their households, to help us break the chain in the transmission, given where we are with the outbreaks at universities at this time. And that was the case for University of Scotland to take forward.
Ian Gray to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you. Yesterday, the First Minister was at pains to explain that the advice on household mixing for students wasn't really different from the advice for everybody else. Given that that's the case, then why did the Minister remove from the guidance prior to universities returning that where work could be done from home, that's what the norm should be?
Minister.
Over the summer, of course, we worked with Scotland's further and higher education sector on guidance for the safe return of our colleges and universities, and we consulted closely with all the stakeholders, the trade unions, student bodies and the universities, of course, and the colleges in the case of further education. And it's always been the case that even the draft guidance that has been circulated for comments and consultation always had the proposal for blended learning. That is whereby students will be learning in many cases online, but there are cases where face-to-face teaching is very important. That, of course, should be limited and only where necessary, and that has been reflected in every version of the draft guidance that was circulated for consultation in the run-up to its publication on the 1st of September. That blended approach to education, student-centred education, is incredibly important at the moment. There are many courses that cannot be taught wholly online, and of course the education experience and interaction with lecturers and tutors is an important part of the education experience as well, and has to take place where necessary.
Ross Greer is followed by Mike Rumbles.
Thank you. In the last few days, a number of students have raised disturbing examples of universities informing them that if they were to terminate the lease for their university accommodation, their place on their course would be terminated as well. I don't believe that this is legally enforceable or morally right, and could I ask the Minister to take this opportunity to state categorically that no student should lose their place at university because they've decided to terminate their accommodation lease and return home?
Minister Richard Lockett.
Well, it's absolutely the case that no student at any Scottish university should have their place on their course jeopardised by terminating their lease in their student accommodation. I have discussed this point with the principals who tell me that is not the case, and I know there have been reports, however, but we will reiterate time and time again that our universities have a duty of care to their students at this very, very challenging time, particularly for those students who are going to university, as I said before, in first year, first time perhaps away from home, and it's already an anxious time for them as well. They deserve absolute maximum support from all of Scotland's universities, and no obstacles should be put in the way in putting their well-being and their education first.
Mike Rumbles followed by Bob Doris.
Police Scotland say that there are no travel restrictions in law, and they never have been. So why were students being told that they could not travel home, giving them the impression that if they did so, they would be breaking the law?
Minister.
The Scottish Government issued guidance at the weekend on students travelling home to put the recent restrictions into the context of a student household. It's only a week or so since we had the new restrictions on meeting other households indoors and social gatherings. And it was very important, particularly what's happening just now in some of our universities where students are self-isolating or perhaps anxious and want to go home, that these restrictions were put into the context, as I said before, of student households. There are no extra laws that apply to students that don't apply to the rest of society at the moment. We must not stigmatise or target students. What's happening at the moment is not their fault or anyone's fault. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. And if students wish to go home, they're perfectly able to do that within the law as outlined in certain circumstances in the guidance that was published at the weekend. But our strong advice to the student population in Scotland is if you are able to, please remain within your current student household in your current student accommodation.
Bob Doris followed by Jamie Green.
Presiding Officer, with colleagues at a constructive meeting with Professor Muscatelli yesterday, where I raised various matters, including restrictions put in place by Glasgow University at Marano Street Student Village regarding the use of common laundry facilities, as well as the current suspension of cleaning services for communal areas. And I know, Minister, that the University is working hard on both counts, including a temporary workaround in relation to this and trying to secure a permanent solution. But can I ask the Minister if he is aware of similar issues elsewhere in Scotland, and can I request that the Scottish Government works with universities to ensure that universities meet their responsibilities and that such matters are resolved speedily?
Minister Richard Lockett.
The Safe to Return to Further and Higher Education guidance that was published on the 1st of September outlined, of course, how the guidelines should be applied to student accommodation and the services that should be made available to students, and how outbreaks should be managed as well in those circumstances. I do very much recognise it's a challenge for Scotland's universities as it is for our students at the current time, and I do thank our university staff and all staff who are helping to care and look after the well-being of our students at this time. But yes, there are some practical challenges, and there have been some teething issues that Bob Doris mentions, and I'll happily look into the specifics of the issue he raises and make sure they're reflected in our ongoing discussions with the sector.
Jamie Green to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you. The multiple changes in guidance all happened over a short few days, completely bereft of parliamentary scrutiny, and has left many students worried about if or how they can socialise or even return to their family homes. Can the Minister put to end some of those concerns and confirm that, first of all, food parcels and priority deliveries will be available for all students in lockdown who need them, that any who choose to leave their accommodation and return home permanently can do so and will be given rent refunds, and that, given that students aren't clear if they can go home for October holidays yet, can the Minister give some reassurances that they will be allowed home for Christmas?
Minister.
Can I just say to Jamie Green, of course he highlights important issues, but we worked with the student bodies on the guidance that was published at the weekend. And I spoke to them again just before this question, and they told me that they very much welcome the guidance, and it has been welcomed across Scotland's campuses. So I urge all students who are feeling they're unable to continue in their current student accommodation, particularly for self-isolating. I hope most people are able to stay in their current student household in their student accommodation, but if not, to access the guidance which explains the circumstances that are there that enables them to return home. And there's different circumstances. You can move your permanent household back to your home household, which of course means you can't move back and forth, because we all subject the whole of Scotland to the same guidelines over households meeting indoor and the social gatherings as well. But the guidance is there and it's clear, and the students have told me it's very much welcomed and it's clear, and it's helping a lot of students at the moment make informed decisions, and that was the purpose of the guidance. The laws have not changed. The guidance explains the law in the circumstances of student households.
And Neil Findlay.
I'm advised that senior government advisers wanted the mass testing of students at universities. Who vetoed that?
Minister.
So the guidance that we are following is, of course, from Scotland's public health officials. And in terms of asymptomatic testing, of course, that is something we keep under review, as I'm sure the Health Secretary and the First Minister have reiterated time and time again. But there's never been anything vetoed in terms of the advice we've received from our own advisers in Scotland. Our advisers in Scotland have taken into account all the SAGE advice, and the SAGE advice was published in the first week of September. And of course, the draft version of that, thankfully, was passed to our own officials, so we could take that into account for our own guidance that was published earlier than that, because our universities in Scotland return earlier. So the guidance from SAGE and from our own public health officials is, of course, taken into account by ministers, and we are focusing our testing capacity on symptomatic students, as the advice asks us to do. And, of course, international students arriving in Scotland from certain countries have to quarantine for 2 weeks as well. And we're advised that's the best way to keep people safe.
Thank you very much. Moving to question 2, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that the backlog of court cases could take up to a decade to clear.
Minister, Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
I welcome the recent report published by the Justice Committee on reopening Scotland's courts and tribunal systems. In common with the report, the Scottish Government recognises the scale of the challenge with regards to the backlog of court cases, something which, frankly, administrations right across the UK and indeed beyond are facing. For example, I know in England and Wales that the outstanding workloads in the magistrate course are now up to 520,000, or were at that level in August. So as I emphasised to the committee, the estimate of a decade to deal with the backlog in Scotland was based on a do-nothing scenario, which is clearly not the approach that we're taking here in Scotland. We've provided the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service with additional funding of £5.5 million. That's to set up the groundbreaking jury centres for High Court trials, which start this week, and which we're optimistic will see up to 16 jury rooms available for High Court trials before the end of November. That is at pre-COVID capacity. We're also working with SCTS to enable jury centre models to be rolled out for sheriff and jury trials, and I'll hopefully say more about that later this week. The Scottish Courts and Tribunal Chief Executive, Eric McQueen, has also confirmed to me the positive progress is being made in recovering volumes of summary business within the sheriff courts. In September, the number of summary trials that progressed with evidence-led were at 80% of pre-COVID levels. So while these are positive developments, we must also be realistic about the scale, the size of the backlog and the time and action it will require to recover fully. And of course, I will update Parliament on the progress of this work in my response to the committee's report.
Liam Kerr.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the answer, but Presiding Officer, what we have to remember here is that for every criminal trial delayed, there is a victim waiting for justice. And the reality is that most of this backlog in Scotland was built up before coronavirus hit. The latest figures show over 80% of the 22,000 trials scheduled at the end of June were carried over from March. To quote directly from the committee report, COVID-19 and lockdown has not created the problem of backlog in cases, rather it has deepened an already existing problem. So, Cabinet Secretary, why was the backlog so big already? Why has it taken a pandemic for the SNP to start taking it seriously? And will the Cabinet Secretary accept the failure to address this has failed thousands of victims?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would say to Liam Kerr, in all seriousness, when it comes to the issue of courts and victims, he is not, I think, in the best books of the victims' organisations for the approach that he has taken as a party. So I wouldn't suggest that the government hasn't done anything to address the backlog. I've given him details of where we've done that. And again, I just referenced the fact that in England there was a pre-COVID backlog of 407,000 cases in the magistrates' court. So backlogs in court cases because of the rise, and he asked the reasons why, because of things like the rise in sexual offence cases coming through the courts, of course, are not simply unique to Scotland. He is right, of course, we should look to address that. One thing the pandemic has taught us is that we can look at innovative approaches like the external jury rooms, like investing in virtual technology, technology for virtual courtrooms. We will look to do that. So we will take forward some of the work that was being done pre-COVID, for example, Lady Dorian's group on looking at how to manage sexual offences cases through our courts. That work delayed because of COVID, but hopefully will continue to progress. We'll continue to do that work, but I hope he understands with the unprecedented challenge of COVID and of the last 6 months, the first priority has been to ensure that backlog does not get any bigger. And through the action I outlined in my first answer to his question, I hope I've been able to demonstrate that. Now that if we get into a position to contain that backlog, my hope is that we can make progress in diminishing it further over the years.
Liam Kerr.
I hear what the Cabinet Secretary says, but I just don't think that victims or the wider public will be reassured that this is under control. I mean, the Cabinet Secretary talks of some possible actions, but I'd like to turn specifically to sentence discounts, where a criminal gets a shorter sentence in return for an early guilty plea. As Victim Support Scotland have made clear, further discounts would cause more confusion and upset for victims. I agree. The Cabinet Secretary is on record as saying he is wary of increasing such discounts, but victims will expect a cast-iron guarantee that such a soft-touch approach will not be countenanced. Will he make that promise today?
Well, this again shows the challenge that we are facing. So on the one hand, Liam Kerr stands up and says the government must do something. And then, of course, on the other hand says, well, they must not do X, Y and Z. So he doesn't present a solution, and that's fair enough, because opposition is really easy, actually. The tough job is being in government and making really difficult decisions. So, look, I appreciate his position, but he's not offered a single solution. What I would suggest to him is he goes back over and reads the Justice Committee report, which he would have been a part of. And I do mention in that, my evidence in that report, which is included, says that we're looking at a number of areas. One is possibly sentencing powers. And I think that's something his party has urged us to look at as well. So looking at adjusting of sentencing powers. And also, as I say, investing in virtual technology. But let's get to the crux of the issue, which is we have to ensure the backlog doesn't increase any further. And I've just given you a fairly detailed answer of how we're doing that across High Court, Sheriff and Jury and Summary courts. So that is our immediate priority. And then, of course, we'll continue to look at how we can further invest in other solutions. And to answer his direct question, looking at discounts is not something that I'm actively pursuing at this current stage.
Thank you, and apologies to Rona Mackay and Rhoda Grant, but I'm afraid I'm not able to take supplementaries in this question. Question number 3, Beatrice Wishart, who joins us remotely. Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking in response to reports that over 900 childminding settings are still to reopen, and the recent Scottish Childminding Association survey that suggests that the sector is on the edge of financial viability.
Minister Marie Todd, who also joins us remotely.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A range of financial support has been open to childminders, including the UK Government Self-Employed Scheme, Income Support Scheme, the Scottish Government's newly Self-Employed Hardship Fund. Childminders delivering funded early learning and childcare have benefited from the commitment to continue payments during the closures period. However, we are aware that not all childminders have been able to access support through these routes. So that's why in June 2020, we agreed with the Scottish Childminding Association to jointly fund the Childminding Workforce Support Fund. In September, the Scottish Government announced an additional £390,000 for this fund, increasing our support for this to £420,000 total. We're also working in collaboration with the SCMA and others to develop and frame our commitment to supporting childminders with targeted activity in the short and medium and long term.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The decision to exclude childminders from the Transitional Support Fund was described by the SCMA as poor and divisive. Justifications from the Scottish Government about fewer operating costs don't add up. Childminders are going to considerable expense and effort to ensure their premises are safe. The survey last week found that childminders have experienced direct increases to operating costs alongside working more unpaid hours. Will the Scottish Government reverse its decision to exclude childminders from the Transitional Support Fund?
So firstly, let me say on record, I'm deeply grateful to everyone in the childcare sector, including childminders, who have supported key workers and their families and vulnerable children during the health crisis. And I recognise that lockdown has hit income in many areas. The Transitional Support Fund was intended to support private and voluntary not-for-profit daycare of children settings to meet the extra costs which were incurred to comply with the public health guidance in response to COVID-19 for these services. The guidance has significant financial implications, including potential physical adaptations and additional staffing for those settings. In contrast, childminders are subject to separate guidance under which the vast majority of childminders shouldn't have to considerably change their operating models, and they can run very close to business as usual in terms of delivery. So the development of the Transitional Support Fund was informed by evidence and analysis. We put out a survey, the SCMA also put out a survey, which the majority of childminders responding to indicated that they expected no change or a decrease in their cost of delivery as a result of the public health guidance. In contrast, though, 79% of the daycare of children respondents reported that they expected an increase in their costs compared to business as usual. So we have continued to work very closely with the sector, including through the SCMA, and we're aware that some childminders have not been able to access support through these other schemes, and that's why we've provided £420,000 in total to the SCMA to deliver the Childminding Workforce Support Fund.
The SCMA is clear that the childminding workforce has declined as local authority provision has expanded. Now 46% say they don't believe they will remain financially viable for more than 6 months without an increase in support or business. The number of childminders has already reduced, and with fears that more could follow, Does the Minister agree that this could have disastrous consequences for parental choice and flexibility?
So there are certainly a number of challenges ahead for the entire sector. I mean, one of the things the SCMA survey showed is that there is a significant reduction in demand for childminding services, as there is for other forms of childcare. And when asked, they said that about 81% of the reduced demand was caused by parents working from home. 74% of the reduced demand was caused by parents being on furlough or made redundant. There is significant flux out there in the sector, and there is a significant change in what's happening. We are absolutely committed to delivering expanded childcare 1140 hours. We have already at the moment, a number of local authorities which are currently delivering, 11 councils which are currently delivering 1140 hours. By the end of October, there'll be another 4 local authorities delivering 1140 hours. And we're determined to deliver that. And we're determined that parents should have the flexibility to choose the type of childcare that suits their family needs best. So we want childminders to be part of that offer. To ensure that we continue progress in the recovery, and all of the challenges that childminders face are recognised. We are continuing to work very closely with them, collaboratively, to strengthen their future position. We'll keep an eye on the future impacts of the pandemic in terms of childminding sustainability as we progress through these stages of the pandemic. And we're also looking to frame with the SME our commitment to supporting childminders with targeted activity in the next, and as I said, in the short, medium and long term.
To move on to the next item of business. That concludes topical questions with a short pause.